All right. Thank you for making room for others, and let's have a seat so we can get started. I'm going to turn it over to Orrin Martin to introduce our speakers, our next speakers.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you all. I want to sing the praises of Stephen Kaffka and Pierre Ott, an agricultural intellectual equivalent to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. But heroes, yes, but heroes with a more sanguine outcome, if you catch my drift. The short version of their CVs would take up all the time we have available today. So in a percussive staccato-like manner, Steve Kaffka, as in the book of Genesis, in the beginning was the Word, Alan Chadwick. He was there at the beginning, 67 through 72, working side by side with Alan, 71, 72 through 77, establishing the farm and the apprentice program, 77 back to school, a second BS here, biology, not liberal arts. Fulbright at Hohenheim University in Germany, master's and PhD from Cornell, and much, much more. Culminating in being a UC Ag extension agent, now working in biomass energy. If Chadwick was the provider, the inspirer, Steve embodies the phrase, the devil is in the details, eh, Steve? Oi. Pierre Ott, both of these gentlemen are truly my heroes. To me, he embodies that old Greek ethic, physical strength and intellectual strength. The man who is at home, as much at home with a scythe in a hayfield as he is down in the soil profile, reading the book to students. Agricultural engineering degree, post-grad work, and work especially with Dr. Herbert Cook at Emerson College in biodynamics and more. Worked with basically an alphabet soup of acronyms of organizations throughout Europe, most notably IFOM, the International Federation of Organic Agricultural Movements. Not only do we owe them a debt of gratitude, they hooked up the yoke. They were yeoman-like, stalwart. They plowed literally and figuratively new ground at the farm and garden. We are now ensconced in the university, academically, agriculturally, and administratively. It wasn't always that way. They did the heavy pulling. They had to deal with the recalcitrant sieve-like soil of the farm in the early years, as well as a recalcitrant sieve-like 25-year-old apprentice in the first university year-long apprenticeship, 1974-75, you know, back earlier in the Cenozoic era when plants first colonized the land. That would be me. So with great respect and a good measure of heartfelt fondness, I'll give you Butch and Sundance. I'll let them arm wrestle about who's who.
Good morning, everybody. This weekend has been very deeply affecting, and as those of you that have gotten older know that there's a certain amount of emotional liability that develops as you get older. So forgive me if I seem a little bit emotional. I'd like to tell you the story of I'd like to tell you the story of the early years of the farm particularly, and its origin in the garden. I'm going to go very quickly, and this is my memory. And I'm sure that there are things I don't remember as well, or all of the things I should remember, but I'd like to at least share some of what I can recollect with you. And this is really the story, the overview. I think about this now, especially now that I'm in a university and I know how universities work. Somehow, really, this impossible place happened. And the aesthetic and esoteric and non-science vision of Alan Chadwick, which is so celebrated in that fabulous movie, Michael, that just was great. Made me realize that Michael Zander did all the work in the garden. But it was somehow, it was able, in some sense, unfertile soil, was able to grow and evolve into this rather magnificent institution, a surprisingly, astounding institution here. So I only go up this far to 1997, and there are lots of extraordinary efforts that went on past that, that were necessary, and if they hadn't happened, it still wouldn't be here. But at least up until that date is what I want to talk about. For me, even more than the fact that the garden was organic, for Alan was about, I would say, high culture and the art of horticulture. We had more flowers, way more flowers in the garden than we had vegetables. The vegetables were there for food, but the flowers were there for beauty and for art and for joy in creation. And that was really, I think, the most potent thing about Alan's view. He was actually quite anti-science in some ways. He would talk about it. In that way, it was difficult for him in the university setting. We never used any machinery. Everything was done by hand with muscle power, as you saw in that labor. And in fact, for me, and I think for many of us, you were given your body. You were taught that you could be strong and affect the earth and move the earth and make things with your muscles. And that's a marvelous gift, especially for young people, but it's a marvelous thing to know. So all those were things that Alan had and contributed and have been celebrated so justly and rightly all weekend long. I think the organic methods were as much an aesthetic choice as they were a philosophical choice as they were a practical one. Alan obviously was an extraordinary man. I feel like I was touched by genius in knowing him, and I think anybody who is touched by genius in their life is affected by that. His coming to Santa Cruz is itself a remarkable story that it's been described elsewhere. We don't have time for that. The garden he created was never planned. No one, when the UC SC campus was being designed and built and conceived, no one thought about a student garden. It just came here somehow. And it came here with Alan through these remarkable circumstances. But since we're talking now about the building of an institution, I also want to give credit to Dean McHenry, the first chancellor, because he was also a man of vision. He was the author of the California Master Plan for Higher Education, among other achievements, and the first chancellor here. But without a man of his character and caliber who was willing to risk these really unplanned and support these unplanned and unforeseen things, this institution could not have happened, and his support was vital over and over and over again. So by 1970, as you could see in that film, the garden was bursting at the seams. There was full of people, full of labor, full of flowers, full of vegetables, full of people. There was, by 1970, a small group of well-trained apprentices, all ex-students, with energy and interest in expansion. Organic gardening was starting to be a topic in the public. It was becoming more and more spoken about, though still not very prominent. There was a lot of reaction to the Vietnam War. My own work there after graduation was as a conscientious objector assigned to service there. So all those forces were active there, and the farm kind of grew out of those cultural moments. The idea for a farm grew out of that energy, that youth, that cultural moment, and Alan's vision. The students, they had a remarkable thing, here's an administrative thing, they had extra student fund money. So the chancellor had the novel idea of letting the students decide what to do with it. I think novel. And what came in first in the referendum was the new student farm. They voted $110,000 for capital expenses to build the farm. You can see here a meeting of the student organization. Dan McGuire was the president at that time. I'm in the picture, but there's many other students who were talking about plans for the expansion, as you can. And here's the letter from the chancellor to Alan and I, that said, yes, you can have a farm, but there won't be very much money. He was glad that there had started to be independent studies, and in other letters that I have from him and that we got from him, He was concerned about non-student participation. And I just mentioned that because it's a constant theme in throughout the project of how to actually manage all this project. The garden got, as you could, was stunning, as you could see, and it attracted a lot of favorable attention. That was really important in the long run to its survival. So the same was true as well of the early farm. It just got a lot of media attention. Sunset Magazine was one of the first. The best article about the early garden, in my opinion, was from Cry, California, The Lessons of the Garden. That was Alfred Heller's publication, and that was his first contact with the garden back in 1970. We helped him write that article. And a lot of interesting and important people actually visited. So Wendell Berry visited the farm, and he gave me this copy of a poem he wrote about it. I have it here. Yeah, it's really, it's actually quite something. But he was just one of many. Ansel Adams came. I mean, it was exciting to people, and that really was important. But there was also, in a way, almost too much coverage. This is from back all the way in 1977. There was an LA Times article about the city of Santa Cruz, and they had a lot about the university. They had one picture of the university building and 4 pictures of the farm. Well, I thought that was great, but if you were a biochemist or a professor of Shakespeare and you had and this is what the LA Times perceived your institution to be about, you see the lady throwing chicken scratch on the, so some of that coverage actually was also a little tricky. And actually, by this stage, that was started to be adverse. Because basically you still had this relatively unformed program. This is a drawing that Alan had done of the first, one of the first drawings for the farm. You see Steve Decatur and Dan. Joe Williamson is the garden editor of Sunset Magazine. He was deeply involved then and stayed deeply involved with the project throughout its history. He was a great friend. And Dan McGuire is there. You see the back of my head in that picture. The idea for the garden was classical. It was Louis XVI's vegetable garden at Versailles. And it was part of this notion of classic horticulture and beauty as a dominant theme. So here's a picture of Joe again in the middle and me and Steve Decatur at the farm site before anything was done. So it's just a nice, we had other sites, behind the carriage house was one that we might have liked better, but we couldn't get that one. There was over by College 5, but this was the one that we eventually settled on. And those are the first beds being dug. There it is. Look at that, busy. I could name most of the people in there. Heidi Skolnick's at the bottom. Rick Lejeune's in there, Doug Bell, and the blonde guy sewing is Dan Rogers, who was a friend but has passed since. But isn't that a great image? The first group of volunteers to really help create the farm were what they eventually called themselves the Home Farm Group. That was one of the names for the farm. You can see, it's not a very good picture. It's on the wall here. There's a better version of it. You can see a bunch of the folks that were the first real, and basically all volunteers. Nobody got paid except me. The first one with the arrow is Kermit Carter, and I just wanted to mention his name because he made very unique contributions, including building the lath house that's still standing there. I'm going to just go through quickly. Here's some images of the early garden. On the bottom right is a picture of me and a man named Frank Reinelt. Frank Reinelt was the creator of the tuberous begonia and the Pacific, the giant delphinium, Pacific giant delphinium, and the primula polyanthus that we have in cultivation. He was an amateur plant breeder who lived in Santa Cruz, had a fabulous old greenhouse that was going to get knocked down at the bottom of Western Drive, Heartwood, original virgin redwood, and he gave it to us. Dean McHenry took that picture. And the home farmers helped come down and take it down and bring it up here, and some of the wood is in the buildings that are here. And I felt that was a passing of the baton, from the horticultural world of Santa Cruz, which is quite rich, to this new project. The home farmers did all helped, so all other volunteers as well, but a lot of this work is, gathered this wood for construction, compost materials, installed the irrigation system, built the cookhouse, cold frames and lath house, built the new barn, which is quite an undertaking, built the fence around the farm, planted the windbreak, made the teepees, dug the first beds, and planted the first trees and berries. Raise your hands. There's a couple of these folks around. Why don't you raise your hands if you're here in the audience? There's Rick's here. Hey, look at that. Here's some more. Here's building, raising of the barn. Used mortise and tenon techniques. This is really, I would say it had a lot to do with this fellow standing here, Brian Barha. You can see him orchestrating the barn raising. Thank you, Brian. And here's an early picture of the farm, I can't be sure, 73, 74. You can see its shape taking place. Notice there's no arboretum yet, or very little. It hadn't established yet. It's quite different than it looks now, isn't it? I want to mention, arboretum is just another extraordinary thing here. Again, unplanned. Just Ray Collette's idea. And McHenry let it happen and supported it. And they're the two most, in my view, almost the two most distinctive things about the campus. Well, here's the farm. And there's the original drawing. And that was it was more or less the way. It was very important to me to be true to that vision. We taught classes while the farm was being built. We made sure the whole point of the farm and the garden was to be a resource for students. That was my personal deep focus. It had to be an available resource for students. That was what was important for me as a student, and I thought it should always be available for other students as well. So we started organizing a series of training, kind of created a series of narrative classes about how you garden, raise beds, compost making, soil management, tree management, that we gave to students. But we also started to give them through university extension to teachers and to support school gardens and to the general public. And it was that connection through university extension that actually led to the idea that university extension might be the basis for a certificate program, or in other words, the first apprentice program. The chronic problem from day one in the garden and all through the farm was how to support a garden and a farm that required extensive and high-quality labor on the basis of student labor, which was going to be erratic and insufficient. It was how to solve that problem was the constant issue, and it got solved through the creation of that first apprentice program, and at least in an institutional basis. We'll talk more about it later. I want to go back and diverge a little bit. This is a picture on the left of Alan Chadwick meeting Francis Edmonds. Francis Edmonds was the head of Emerson College, and Emerson College is devoted to the teachings of Rudolf Steiner. Alan had known Rudolf Steiner as a teenager and was deeply influenced by him. But he didn't really talk much. You can correct my memory, those of you, but he didn't really talk much about biodynamics or anthroposophy. He had a redigested version of it. Until Francis Edmonds came, and this was the biggest social event we ever had in the garden. We fed 120 people salmon, which I cooked on a chain link fence. You don't know about that. It was good, though. It was good. It was good. And Francis Edmonds came, and then subsequently he suggested that Herbert Cook come. Herbert Cook was the head at that time internationally of the biodynamic agriculture movement, German soil scientist who had devoted his life to biodynamic agriculture. And he became a dear friend and mentor. And so you can see some pictures of him here. And because of Herbert, we were able to find and somehow lure Pierre Ott over here. And Pierre Ott's presence was really important to the success of the first apprentice program and to really the introduction, I would say, of science in a more formal way, soil science particularly, into teaching here at the Farm and Garden. I was a philosophy major. Some people think I still am. And I couldn't do those kinds of things. And so Pierre was able to introduce those elements. And I wanted to have two other pictures here. One is, of course, of Stanley and Louise Kane. And Stanley was a lovely, again, we became friends. We had our wedding reception at their house. But Louise was a dynamo. She really took the Friends of the Farm and Garden issue on, and she understood institutionally the need for formal structure and management. So she wrote a little white paper to rationalize having a certificate program through UNEX, and she helped me draft the curriculum and so on. And at the bottom is Dean McHenry. And so I'm going to stop here and introduce Pierre. But before I do, I want to just give you an example of the kind of precariousness of the development of the project, which was more or less constant. So we tried to get some additional money to fund Pierre to come over and help with this project through the university. This is all soft money. This is a non-academic program, so the chancellor had to find it in some drawer somewhere every year, literally. And somehow or other, when I found out what the budget was going to be for the next year, there was no money for Pierre. And I was really deeply distressed. And so it's just like a Friday. And, I was, going on about this all weekend with my wife, Beth, and she said, why don't you just call Dean McHenry? I said, I can't do that. She said, yeah, just call him. Thank you, Beth. I did. That Sunday night, and he said, okay, we'll find the money for Pierre. It was like that close. And I suspect that went on for quite a while, even after I was done. But it was like that often, all the time. So again, Dean was there. Pierre came, and the rest is history. So Pierre, it's your history now.
Well, Dean McHenry and Professor Kempf are the two persons that brought me to Santa Cruz. And I have great appreciation for these two persons, okay? I was part of the '68 movement in France and the years after. And I must say that coming to Santa Cruz, early 70s, discussion about the Vietnam War, I felt here at home. And we started here with $46 in our pocket when we landed, okay? And $26 of these $46 were devoted to buying a scale for our baby that was 7 weeks old when she arrived here, 5 of these weeks in intensive care. And we managed to have biodynamic food, biodynamic milk, and she never seen a doctor anymore. Okay, so that was a great event. Next one, I guess. This is a photograph of the first apprenticing group, and my function was actually to make the link between the practical work that was done on the farm and the academia uphill, and it was really interesting to see in terms of layers, the farm being down below and the academia being up there. So my function was actually to lift up the farm to the academia, respectively, to bring the academia down a little bit to earth. And we talked about Alan Chadwick. Alan Chadwick was a non-scientist, and I gave some lectures in Tiemann's lab. So you can imagine the contrast. And if Alan Chadwick didn't stay here at the project, this was actually a confrontation of two polarities, okay? And I had the feeling, I realized right now that at that time, I was just in the middle of this polarity, and that was also indirectly great strength for me. So I had to teach classes about soil science, about plant nutrition, and the relationship between all these in relation to our practical work on the farm, digging, what does it mean digging in terms of soil science, plant nutrition, these kind of things. I had also the function of not only raising the level to academia, but to bring the academia down to the farm with the students. And students had projects, and we had independent study with goats, with bees, with plants, with orchard, with pruning. And as an example for you to understand, in biology, you speak about digestion, okay, what the difference between human digestion and ruminant digestion. So they had to write a paper on goats, okay? But, they had to do the milking. And Stephen mentioned that one of the big issue about the project was to secure the labor, okay? And students were quite interesting to talk to. They were also interesting to lead them into the work. But usually on Saturday and Sunday, they were gone. But the goats were there. So I have to remind about Jim Nelson and myself. We were the two guys that were taking turns on weekends to milk the goats and get the milk at home, and we make cheese at home. So by the less, with $46 when you arrive here the first 6 months, you just live off the produce of the farm. You don't go to the restaurant. Or Safeway downtown was once a week or once every 2 weeks, So we were quite happy to have the milk of the goats and the cheese from them. I had also a position as a visiting lecturer, and there was a big issue how to call this lecture. Okay, it had to do with soil, but in Santa Cruz, soil science was strictly unthinkable. Okay, so we turned around, and it became an introduction to pedology. So. For those, we avoided the term soil science. For those that don't know what pedology is the study of the history of the soil, and every soil has an history and a future, okay? And pedology is actually to study the history to get the potential of its development. And I was known on campus digging holes everywhere. And that was not really interesting for the physical plant. Well, when you see somebody digging holes in the prairie, you have to have a construction permit, no? Okay, you can't just do like that. So that's was quite interesting. This first group of apprentices, we had some characters, and one of them just contributed to the introduction of Stephen and myself, Oren. He's the second from the right. Okay, so it's amazing that Oren managed to stay as long as he did, and he does. Another encounter was, to me, was really something special. I had in this group a female mechanic. So it was early 70s, I'd say, these days in construction work, you see ladies, no problem, driving buses and stuff like that, but late 60s, early 70s. No, women were in the kitchen, babies and so that, but female mechanics. But again, coming back to physical plants, if we were talking about commercial market gardening for the farm, we needed a tractor. So the tractor and physical plants, they say, well, we have to have a nice little tool for these little guys at the farm. And they bought a Goldoni. A Goldoni is a small four-wheel tractor, articulated in the middle. Okay, it's good to do your road works and stuff like that, but you can't use it for mechanical weeding. Okay, so we found a little tractor somewhere, a farm tractor, and it didn't work. It was running, but it didn't work properly. And with Murphy Weaver, she's the third one from the left. We dismantled that farm, we took it apart and rebuilt it, and it worked. Some of the work we did late at night with the people from physical plant were gone because, again, you're not supposed to do mechanics here. They have a garage there, so, okay. Another interesting person was Ron Tyler. Ron Tyler, you see him on the left picture, and he's down there. Yeah, he's an extension. He worked here, and we intended to have a variety of trees, collection of cherry, pear, apples, plums, and so forth. And he spent remarkably a lot of time teaching us, teaching the apprentices. And I was yesterday within the tour of Oran, and he was explaining how to prune and stuff like that. So that I heard the words of Ron Tyler, and I was really pleased to see that educating a tree, shaping a tree, are still words that belong to the DNA of the project. Well, this is a good picture of what we called at that time the French intensive biodynamic system. Okay, this was a construction from Alan Chadwick, and it was French because he had that vision that Stephen showed on the garden of Versailles. I don't really agree with what Steve said about because there is a fundamental difference between French gardening and British gardening. Okay, and what Stephen showed has nothing to do with British gardening. Okay. French intensive. I am French. I studied biodynamics with Kepf. That's probably the reason why I landed over here, and I was a good alibi work or alibi action to synthesize this French intensive biodynamic system. Here, a few views of the farm as it was at that time. We have the beds, we have the vegetable house at that time where we were preparing vegetables for the stand. We had a wagon at the entrance, and once a week we were starting already to sell vegetables. On the far right you have the row crops, behind you have the raspberries. Here again, the picture is not that good. Having a baby and being far from the grandparents. My wife invested in a movie camera. Okay, so I have very little good ones, and the technology, the colors are fading a little bit. Here some apprentices of the first program, and in the middle there is I don't know her name. If somebody can recall me the name. Okay, thank you so much. At least my trip here in Santa Cruz was worthwhile to fill the gap. She was, I had a hard time not to find her name because she was so enthusiastic. So every day she was smiling. She was very good. She was entertaining the good mood in the group. It was really fantastic. Here I have picture Marvin on the left and Jim Nelson. He's not here, but his wife is here. So, Jim was somebody that, when I was there, carried a lot of the burden, the responsibility of the farm. And as I mentioned already, he did some of the milking. He's working very hard on shaping a raised bed. At that time, we were talking about raising the beds. We were talking about double digging. In some cases, we were doing triple digging. Okay, everything was meant not to have things according to the books, but everything was made to really make sure that whatever grows has the very, very, very best condition to be able to fold up. Down there, compost. That was also something that was very important on the farm. We put the compost behind over the hill, okay? Because when we were having tour with children and things like that, it was that nice. But compost was very important. And browsing around the garden yesterday, I looked at few tables with compost and stuff like that, and I found the words, you have to mix greens, you have to mix brown, you have to have air, you have to have water. Again, these were our words that time, and to see them in a written form right now, again, I'm pleased to see that the fundamentals are still, again, part of the DNA of the project. That's the last picture that I have to comment. And up on the left, you have a really nice bed, lots of vegetables, lots of green material. We didn't have drip irrigation at the time. We were just, water was tender loving care that we were distributing to the plant. Okay, so it was not necessarily that you have to account how much in liters, when to, because the moisture and stuff like that. No, watering was just done to make sure that everything was fine. And on this bed, I finish on this picture. From time to time, we had early in the morning to come back when we are making the first round to see what kind of job we have to do. I had, to tap on the shoulders of, meditating women and saying, listen, this is a public place. Please, you have to wear clothes, So, I guess this was part of my education as in the hippie world of Santa Cruz.
It was really so great working with Pierre. I'm fortunate to be remained friends all these years. There were these things you had to do as leaders of the garden, but you wouldn't necessarily want to do, like asking women to do that. But I just want to finish with a couple of slides. The aesthetic and creative ideas of Alan Chadwick were part of the first years of the project and were so important. And we tried in the apprentice program to maintain that as well. So we kept the garden, we worked in the garden. We asked apprentices to do creative projects of their own design, which we would vet. They had to build or make something unique. Some of the old greenhouse up there, some various projects and so on were done. And it was important to me that legacy somehow be preserved. If you could do this work in the right way, in the right setting, it had its own power. And I think that it seems evident that is more or less a true thing, because there are so many people who have benefited and loved the work and loved the setting and loved doing the work in that way. By 1997, the work of creating this institution was still very unfinished. And others had played vital roles along the way that were critical. I mentioned Louise Kane, Phyllis, and is it Robert Norris? Ken Norris. I'm sorry, I got his name wrong. I don't know why I should forget that, because they were becoming deeply involved in the project, and Ken really led the development of an academic evaluation and program here. Jim Nelson, Orrin Martin. I think if I did anything well during that time, it was, giving Orrin a shot at this, because that's pretty much all I needed to do to make sure this place would survive and thrive afterwards. And Alfred Heller had been deeply interested and was already talking about making a large donation to the farm and garden, but it wasn't the right time. But he had a role in creating the first endowed chair here, and he had remained a supporter all through that time. And again, but the farm and the garden at that time, the time that I left, went back to school here in biology, and then on to my long trek through the institutions for other degrees. At least the farm and garden had been preserved and established. And I think one of the main reasons that this thing survived is because it was there. It was a physical reality. People saw it, valued it, worked in it. It was just there, and having it be there and having it have an active life, I think was it was hard to resist that. We had tried to create an institutionally acceptable model for the labor problem through the apprentice program, and we had done that. It stopped again, I think, for a while, but at least the seeds of how that could be done were there. We had an active Friends organization. We had interest developing in College 8, including a clear understanding that this had to be an academic program, and I think the rest, but there was a lot of work that had to be done and a lot of uncertainty. And we had the first agroecology experiment at the farm that I did. That was over by the cookhouse. So there was starting to be that kind of work. And I think to end, I would say that somehow the improbable and the impossible happened. And it's just a remarkable thing here this weekend to see and feel the energy and affection for this project, and it's just very lovely, and thank all of you for that.
Well, thank you again, Steve and Pierre, and everyone you represented here, the home farmers and the early apprentices who helped to build the farm and the garden and take us to where we are today.